right. So this conversation, I think I'm going to title it Pain and Transcendence. There's a number of different themes, but I really, really like the conversation. So before I go into it further, some housekeeping. So if you're interested in circling, which is what I do at in my company, the Circling Institute, we have every Thursday night we have open events, so anybody can come. We also have weekends. We have one coming up in like 2 or 3 weeks, and we have the Art of Circling, which is the year-long training program. And circling is a whole world. In many ways, much of what I talk about in much of what we discuss in these conversations, at the heart of it is what circling is about, right? This kind of deep dialogical sense in which one can be, in some sense, transformed through a certain kind of relating, like a dialectical, authentic, genuine engagement with another. And so circling is really essentially about that practice. So I want to encourage you to check that out. The links are below for that. If you're interested in working with me one-on-one, go ahead and email me. I am taking clients right now. So just email me and I'll get back with you. Okay, so with this conversation, it's I really like these guys. So this is our second conversation of the three of us, or the four of us. What do I want to say about this? So I would say that this kind of this rides the line, right, between what I would say is interpersonal, deeply personal, and you could say abstract or transpersonal, if you will. And I really appreciate that line, kind of going between talking about these very kind of abstract things, like with Heidegger and Nitsishani and all these people that we're talking about, and these ideas that we're discussing, and then at the same time, like bringing it back to our actual kind of experience, and also being aware of the dialogical process in itself that goes harkens all the way back to Plato, right? So all these different levels are happening in this conversation and are in some sense self-aware, that they're happening. So, on some level, we could say that the conversation is that happened like a few hours ago is what you're about to watch. But then again, perhaps the conversation happens in your listening.
Get clearer.
Right.
But what's so intense about it is the clearness that it brings to light is it's pure symbolism all the way down. Like the symbol is the reality. And that's why I find the Nishitani article difficult, because I think that's what he's getting at with emptiness and imagination.
Yeah.
Where somehow the symbol
is all the way down, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Wow, that's interesting. I was not expecting to hear that and asking you the question, what do you mean by good when you say you're good? I was not expecting to hear that maybe the fundament of reality is symbolic all the way down. Mm-hmm. But thanks for the update.
Okay.
So Zeb, what's it like? Would you recommend it?
Recommend what? Sorry, go.
Whatever it's like over there. Whatever the phenomenology is like, symbolic or otherwise.
Yeah, it's interesting when Seth said the symbol is more real than the material, the substance. And I was watching this movie last night, The Man from Earth. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's like a 2007 film.
Oh yeah, that's a good movie.
Have you seen it?
Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, I
Okay.
thought about that movie so much. Like I
I
still
don't
think
know.
about that movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I watched it for the second time after all those years, and I don't want to give too much away, but there was this question around. So this person is speaking about his life, and it makes you wonder whether is should I be satisfied that those things were actually true, the events that happened were actually physically happened and they were true, or whether the symbolic mythical meaning behind those events are much more real than if the thing actually physically happened. And and yeah, and it was interesting to see how others were reacting to this person who's telling the story, and it seemed to me that they were very much entrenched into the symbolic idea of an event rather than the event itself. And there's this threat that symbolic meaning that they had lived with throughout their whole lives was under threat if there was any question of the event being true or not.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
It's really quite cathartic.
yeah,
It's a movie about watching a group of people basically, basically, um, it kind of personalizes on some level the time, like the time we're in, and takes it right through the eye of the needle into a catharsis. It's just really brilliant. I thought it was really
it is.
brilliant.
Yeah, so you guys watch it. It's on. I think it's on Amazon Prime.
Hmm.
I think there's a follow up to it. So there was a trailer after that film. There's a follow up.
Oh, there
So
was.
yeah, apparently, yeah. So that movie was made in 2007, and there is a very recent follow-up to it. So check it out. I think it gets quite interesting. But I don't want to give too much away because that will
Right,
spoil it.
right, right. That's
But there
interesting.
is this question about the symbolic meaning of something that happened, or rather than, what's more meaningful, what's more important, the symbolic meaning behind it, the
Hmm.
myth,
Hmm.
or the actual event itself.
Hmm. Or the process that they went all through,
Yeah.
right? Because there's that is that other thing, because I think that's also the case with Platonic dialogues, right? And it's often missed, right? Is oftentimes Plato and like is seen as the dialogues as laying out a bunch of propositions. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not that it's not doing that, um but there's a big argument to be made that there's a reason why it's in the dialogical form, and that the process of the is as much saying something, right, as what's being talked
Yeah.
about, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's probably more value and importance in
Yeah,
that dialogical participation,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
And in everyone involved in that kind of hermeneutic interpretation of something that happened.
yeah,
That's where all the value, that's where all the fun is,
yeah,
not in
yeah,
the kind of propositional truth or false claims.
yeah,
That's boring, it's meaningless. Yeah.
yeah. It's the experience one undergoes,
Yeah.
and like in being able to propose and be proposed to, right? Like it's the it's the things that one exercises in oneself in order to comprehend like some concept that in comprehending it, right,
Mm.
can be can lead to a shift in your kind of your axiomatic presuppositions, right? And that's when you start talking at that level, right? Because your axioms, right, these kind of deep, and they're usually unconscious, right? They're so implicit, um, that just the fact of explicating them, making them explicit, changes their position. It's a kind of transcendence, and I think that transcendence, right, is in my experience has been probably the most religious kind of experience of my life, right?
Mm.
It's been hard. It's hard to put that into words, right? um because on some level, what you're reading, right? You have to take seriously what you're reading. Otherwise, it just doesn't like, or what you're talking about. You got to like, you have to play the game as if life depends on it on some level, right? You know. However, on another respect, like the content is almost, at least at a lived level, is shows itself maybe not being as important as that, right? But rather the process of grappling, right? Going through the dialectic. And that's the whole notion of dialogos, right? And I think that that we've been talking about as a practice, right? As a perhaps one of the ways that you can actually kind of like deal with or confront or work through the nihilism of our age, right? Because there is that sense in which, not in this, I don't see it in the in I don't see people like exalting like a sense of nihilism in the Nietzschean sense. It's like I don't see people walking around talking about their nihilism, right? It's more insidious than that. It's more that people just don't have any sense of like the ontological difference, right? And their life is set up in such a way to not notice it, right?
Yeah, that's the kind of passive nihilism that Nietzsche despised, actually.
Yeah.
He was more into the active nihilism.
Right.
Kind of embracing the Dionysian.
Yeah. So therefore, asking Seth, how you doing? He's like, good. And I'm like, what do you mean by good? It's like, well, I've been reading Corban, right? And I've realized so what do we want to let's go around and just find out what are we doing here? What do we each want out of this dialogue? What do we Oh, let me shut this off. Hang on.
I will start recording, okay?
Okay.
You are recording.
I can, I think.
I think you have been.
Yeah.
I gave you permission.
What are we doing here?
Right. Well, I thought we were going to talk about death, post-death. And then I saw my calendar, it said post nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Both the same. They're synonymous, right?
Right.
So we could take both.
Right. Yes, neo-post.
Yeah,
Pseudo nothing.
Yeah, post-death, post-nothing.
Mm-hmm.
As I was driving down in my car, I was thinking, I had this really strange thought, actually. I thought, was my life always potentially there? And if I hadn't come into this time, then it would have been inevitable at some point in time. I don't know why I thought that.
What was the thought?
It was inevitable. My coming into existence was absolutely inevitable. Whether it's this time, another time, I don't know why that significant thought just popped into my head as I thought about this conversation we were going to have, and so I think I was thinking about post-death and what does that mean in terms of existence? Because I think you can't separate the two, death and existence. So I was thinking, well, one day I will die. I'll be no longer existing in the way that I know now. If I had never existed, would it still be inevitable that I would exist? Was the potential always there?
Right. Well,
does that also mean is the possibility or potential? Does that just carry on? Is that eternal?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think that's what Corban reminds me of, though, and maybe a better word is helps me to remember, right? Like the Platonic remembering, where you're like remembering, and what you're remembering is that the outside isn't outside and the inside isn't inside. And what I mean by that is, like we were talking about before we got on, what I found good about Corban is he discusses with the Sufis how this participation actually changes your senses. And like I hear you guys saying, like, you read a sentence and it's a profound sentence that by the time you get done with it, you're a different person than when you started the sentence. That's the idea of death in life, where somehow when you go through the dialogic process, when you come out the other end, you are a different person, but it's a different person that you remember who you actually are. So it's that weird kind of death to your real self. And like it's uncanny. And that's the almost terrifying part about reading someone like Corban is he's someone with so many credentials, so many people vouching for him. And then you go and read him, and then you're like, oh, these credentialed people that are vouching for him are taking what he's saying seriously, and what he's saying is the most esoteric stuff I've ever read. Like, just beyond. But that's where you have to be wary of not getting trapped in like looking at it through a material lens. Like when he's talking about the Orient, the North Pole, I guess that's a apt word to use right now, North Pole. When he's talking about this stuff, it's more the symbolism of it, and this calling it symbolic isn't denigrating it, it's actually elevating it.
Right. So again, we're valorizing the symbolic meaning of something,
right,
rather than the material thing.
Well, in what way is Zeb? In what way, in that thought, right? In the thought of, could I have been if I haven't been, right? Basically, what you're saying.
Exactly.
Like is the inevitability of my death that somehow my life already announces, right? So it's already there, like prior to my demise, if you will, right? In fact, my demise is just one of the ontic meanings that receives its determination from already the existence is its existence to the fact that it's finite, right? That it's already there from the very, just like the note of the music, like the first note is already, it's the beginning and the end. It's already, that's what makes it, gives it its identity, right? So,
and then the anticipation of the next note, you know, that in between moment,
right.
It's not arrived, but it's inevitable,
right?
And you can just feel it.
It's
not measurable. You just know, you know, there's the next note. It completes the note that you just heard.
Yep, exactly. And on some level, the thing that you can say did happen to some degree, the history, right? In some ways, the gravity, because I do think that that's if you read Heidegger, and especially in his earlier work, right, where he talks a lot about kind of primordial time, right, and he has in his really earlier work, he's really a lot more loyal to kind of the project of phenomenology with Husserl, right? So it's like it's a little different than his later work, but he talks about that you get this sense where it's actually the flow of time is something existentially is like something like the future. It goes future, past, and that arises as the present, right? So like I always thought about that as like there's this ineffable prehending, right, that comes forward and like in some sense like becomes in the gravity the previous way of interpreting things, right? that arises as our in the moment experience of right now, right? Like you can understand it in that sense of like that you're in some way like your history is the gravity, right? Um, that calls forth the future from the future, right? And in that sense, origin, right? If you think about the notion of origin, well, this just has me like start to really. I mean, I think all of this speaks to like what how primary transcendence is for us.
Mhm.
Like it really is. It's like it's not. It's almost like for us, the human being. It's not like we're a being that then transcends. It's like from the moment the notes played of ourselves, right, is is transcendence, right? Like it's more like that's transcendence is the way that in which we're constituted, right? In that sense. So Daniel just he did his famous Daniel prayer. Let's listen. Let's listen closely.
That's deep contemplation going on.
Yes.
Speak, Daniel.
No, this was great, and it reminded me on what Nishitani writes. Kind of like this idea, this mystery of the origin points at this problem of the transmigration in Buddhism of the souls, and for him, time is ring-like, right? So it's this ring that goes into future and past, only to come back to itself in the present moment. And arise from there and give you a ground as well. Because he would say, he writes in Religion Nothingness something like however infinite the past and the future may be, the fact that you're actually there right now in your Dasein, that you are there, that is something you cannot really question away. It's probably the only fact that we really have, that we are there right here, right now. But what you say is important, because I mean, Ueda, I read a few papers from him. He was a disciple of Nishitani, and he says that we are always living in a double world. What he says the same thing. We always have a beyond, a transcendence. And there's a certain limit and something that is beyond the limit, but which we can't know. And we call this limit then something like nothing. And in kind of like Heidegger would say, in the Thing essay, he writes, as the shrine of nothing, death harbors within itself the present thing of being. So kind of like that which is on the tip, beyond the beyond, so to say. that's the mystery of being, and that's always there in a sense.
Right.
And
like yeah, keep going.
No, go on, please.
No, I was just gonna say, like it's like the ineffable. Like it's just really interesting. When you said it was really great the way that you laid that out. Was really great. That sense in which, yeah, there's the beyond in which we can never know. And there's a way in which, though, there is that which I can't represent, right? But by the very fact that we're speaking about it, in some level, it's present, right? Like it's like, in fact, it may be the very most primordial thing that's actually present is this domain of that I don't know. And I know that I can't know, right? The question is how is it that that's present? Like, how do I know that there's a domain which I will never know? It's impossible for me to know. Yet there's something I know in that, right? And it reminds me of the ineffable, right? Which is always somehow present or constituting, at least. I don't know if present is the right word, but it has me just wonder about that tip of the mystery.
That's why I think someone like Andrew Taggart talks. He says the perfume of being, that you can realize presencing itself while you're meditating, or we call it like the background, or this primordial silence.
Yeah.
That lies beneath the notes and enables them to emerge in their musicality, and also that they can emerge as meaningful patterns to us. And it's that which also gives, I mean, grounds both us, the listeners, and the music and the musical instruments, but also that flows in the in-between, the musicality and the notes and all of these things.
Right. Well, in some sense, if we ask Zeb, right, is it possibly, like, if we say, like, okay, in order to think the thought that you thought, right, about, like, if I wasn't, it is my inevitable coming into being, right, or myself, and as inevitable as my death if I wasn't born, right? What is it? Could we say that something like the presence of the ineffable, the mystery, right? Is that something, that very question, is that a way in which, in what way is that in relationship to that very question? These questions that we can ask ourselves, right? Which on some level, they're at a different level of, like, we'll never get to the bottom of them, right? Yet there's something necessary, like there's something inherently necessary in asking them. If you're going to actually be concerned about anything, the moment I'm concerned about anything, it's connected to everything, right? And therefore, I'm always already in a relationship to all of that, right? Of the whole Western metaphysics, the understanding of being, all of that happens and is governing in the fact of my finding myself here being a being that's concerned. A walking bag of concerns and considerations, right?
I think the phenomena there, when I'm thinking about this, the thought that I express, I think links to this phenomena of my wish to not die. The phenomena is this longing that I have of never to die, and it feels like it's my actual essence, the actual existence, the essence of my existence is a longing to never die, and I think from that phenomena emerges this thought or this question. I think that's all I can boil it down to. Otherwise, why would I have that thought? Why would I even bring it up?
Right. What is that? Yeah. What is already under? In other words, is it fair to say? What is already in some semblance that question? What presupposes is, like, what's the conditions of the possibility, right? That question is addressing, right? Like, it's like, for example, I think about this oftentimes with, it's to get at like how deeply human beings are given by possibility. It's almost impossible to comprehend how deep, like, temporal we are in that sense. So, for example, there's like, I often use the idea that I haven't thought about walking through walls, right, today, or right, because it's not present as a possibility. However, right, if there was some way, right, in which through this conversation, it can light up as possible for me to walk through walls, I guarantee you that's all I'll be thinking about, right, on some level. So there's something that there's like the fact of any movement of consciousness, of attention, of orientation, of action, of listening to something is always given by something understands something as possible. Otherwise, it's almost like the lines that it 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 goes inside of, right? So I guess that's the question of like just that question that your existence is asking, right? Mm-hmm. What's already possible? Like, what are the conditions of its possibility?
I think one of the conditions would be the fact that you weren't the one that caused yourself to exist in any material way that we know of. So this idea that your existence is inevitable seems to be conditioned on the fact that you weren't the one that did it, seemingly. Who actually knows, I guess. But I guess that's also a broader definition of who you are. But there's something to the fact that you didn't do it. So the fact that you didn't do it makes it seem as inevitable because it was inevitable.
Would you just tears up?
Yeah, I think what we're trying to explore here, not propositions, but this. We're not even trying to do ontology here. I think we're trying to tap into the imagination. I think this is what Seth, when I heard him speaking about Corban, I think it immediately occurred to me what we're trying to tap into is ineffable, and it's in the imaginal. And why is it that we're able to do that? Again, I fall back into sort of trying to connect senses and reason to that question, like why are we even capable of living in the imaginal? Like, why should that even be necessary? So I'm still searching for the kind of rational position with that, and the trick is to not do that, because as soon as you try to do that, you're right outside of the imaginal again.
Maybe like, or we can look at what seems to be necessary, right, about seeking reason and rationality. Like, in some sense, it may not be the road that will be the most fruitful, but something is possible through that. What is that, right? What did you just get? What are you getting, Daniel?
Well, what I'm getting is kind of like how Seb is struggling with all of these ideas. I mean, I've seen this with Seb because we have gone through Nishitani's book, and I have often noticed how kind of like Seb tends to go back to this kind of like, this I doubt everything. I'm a good Kantian in that sense, and I stick to my reason. And then reason has its place. Although when we tap into the ineffable, then it's kind of like we're really on the border, this kind of like borderland, right? Where it's kind of like when John Waweki shows this kind of like, you're in the box and everything that's outside of the box is like, it doesn't make any sense to you. And then you have this insight, this flash of insight, and it moves you in the more space out of the box. And then everything that's was before out of the box suddenly makes sense. And I think that for like dialogical practice as one method, so to say, to do that is to get you out of the box, just like contemplation or other practices that afford transcendence can help to do that and bring that aspect identity shift,
Mm-hmm.
bring it about. And that's why Masao Abe writes in Zen and Western Thought, on one of the first pages he writes, practice is absolutely necessary. And also I think in the paper from Ueda I sent you, he also says, I mean, you don't maybe, Zazen as a sitting practice is good, but there's poetry, there's prayer, for example, what we have cultivated in the West. There are things like active imagination, what Carl Jung developed. There's the deep Platonic dialoguing that can bring about something like transcendence, just like the Zen master and the disciple also always come together in a dialogue, right? That's also worth noticing, I think. And that's what we are doing here. So I think we are making use of this very old practice.
Yeah, what are we doing? What are we doing here?
Yeah, we are dialoguing around and trying to get out of the this kind of like frame. And Ueda also talks about it, by the way, because he says when you think that beyond is literally nothing, then you have really like a limit. Then it's like it's cut off, and your depth is really like, then it's really a border. Yeah. But as soon as you can make this shift towards that, it's that you right now you are in the both simultaneously in the limitedness but also in the limitlessness. If you can manage to see that, then kind of like this nihilism goes away.
Right.
Yeah, I like when Daniel said flash. He said flash in his dialogue there, and it immediately occurred to me, actually, my consciousness feels like a flash of light in the eternity of darkness. It feels just like a glimmer of light. And what I yearn for is to flood that eternity of darkness. Yeah. And that's what I yearn for. But what I actually experience is just a flash.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, Seb, with you, with Nishitani, because Ueda writes in a short paper, which is called My Teacher, which he wrote after Nishitani died. He says in a memory of his, he says that he also had these thoughts of, nihilism, despair, suffering. And then he said this once to Nishitani, and he said, just, that's good. That's a good thing. And I think that's because you grapple with your mortality, in that's something we many people have already like stopped doing, but you grapple with your mortality, and that's of course terrifying when you do it, because yes, because you as you say, you're this little flash of light, and beyond you is this darkness that kind of like confines this flesh in this prison, and but still you grapple with it, and I think that's the best. That's how it starts. That's how the transcendence starts, I think.
So let's go, Seth. Give it a shot. Let's just summarize. If you were to tell the story, a summary of the story from the moment the call started up until now, like just take us on the ride of like, what is the dialogue been shaped? What's its shape so far?
Well, it's gone into an oddly familiar shape for me, because you started out asking, "How are you doing?" I said good. You said what's been good. I said I've been reading Corbin's The Man of Light, and we started off that way. And we've been talking about the ineffable. What does it mean that we can even talk about the ineffable? Aren't you not supposed to be able to talk about it? Well, we're not talking about it, but we are, like, that weird space that we're trying to get into. And then Zeb was talking about how, like, the way I felt it was, because you really animated yourself, Zeb, when you said it, but you're like when I'm like feeling conscious is, I feel like a flash of light that's trying to like fill up the entire world and try to eliminate this darkness. And then Daniel was talking about that, and he used the word imprisonment. And then I had the thought like, oh, I don't want to bring up the word because it's a bit of a faux pas, but I had a synchronicity because of the fact that Corban in the Man of Light is talking about Gnosticism, even though he really doesn't use the word Gnosticism. But it's the idea that we're a divine spark that's imprisoned by a false deity. And yeah, that's the encapsulation I've had of the discussion so far, where one interesting thing I might add to it though is this feeling of being a flash of light. Corban would actually say that like that's incredibly good to have that feeling, because what he says is that like knows like, or only like can know like. And the idea that you're feeling like a flash of light means that you're going to be able to perceive light. And what he means by light is the symbolic light of just, and I think that ties into Nishitani, where you start to see nihilism in a positive light, where it actually becomes a thing that dissolves. It's a solution to your problems because it dissolves the material prison that you find yourself in.
And I just want to say, going back to this, you know, when I walk on the fields near my home, there's like a very dense fog, right? And I often think of maybe nihilism. We could make it with this analogy, kind of like you're walking through the dense fog. You just see the border ahead of you. You can't see anything. But the funny thing is that at some point, just when the sunlight comes through, it could be that this fog disappears in 5 minutes. And then you see the bright sky and everything's open. And right?
Yeah, that's like I've heard the word diaphanous before, but I actually didn't know what it meant. And what it means is it's usually a piece of fabric that you can see through, but not all the way through. And that idea of the fog reminds me of that. And what's awesome about something that's diaphanous is it's the only way you can actually look at something as beautiful.
You got diaphanous. Thank you. I really like the last part of what you just said.
Seth, you just had a lag, so maybe the last 20 seconds.
You just had a nothing. You had a nothing, Seth. Yes. It's awesome.
No, all I was trying to say is something diaphanous. You can see through it, but not all the way through it. So it reminds me of the fog. And what I've noticed is like the most beautiful sunsets and sunrises actually need some occlusion. They need something diaphanous. Like in ancient Greek myth, if Zeus showed himself fully, like the person just died. Like it's just too much. But there's something about that fog analogy that really just struck me. And too, like whenever I've gone into fog, it's actually something that almost like pulls you in even further, because there's a bit of the mystery there, but it's not darkness. It's just hiddenness.
The sense I get with Seth, with Zeb, is especially your description, Daniel, of knowing Zeb, right? In this way that he kind of really brings it in himself, right? And looks at his own life and his own experience in these kind of very meta notions, right? And that kind of gravity that comes with that, right? And then the inclination to offer different ways to start to get at that. I think, though, the thing I really kind of sense is that what I get from Zeb, and I relate to this, is like something just hurts. Like it's like if it didn't hurt, I doubt we'd even be asking the question. Something is painful about having flashes, let's say, of this transcendent, but yet it being accessible for most of of the other time, right? There's something about that is just painful. And like, I think what you're saying, I think what I'm hearing you say, Zeb, is like, you're basically going like, look, why is it got to hurt? Right? Or there's something about the pain or the twist or the there's something untransparent about the pain, right? Yet I want to say something about there's a kind of dignity somehow around it, right? What do you think about that, Zeb? What do you think about that, Zeb?
Yeah, just thinking. Yeah, that there's definitely the phenomenon of pain in terms of anguish, despair, the sense of loss, the sense of loss that is coming.
Yeah.
That's the nihilism that I'm swimming in. You know, trying to keep my head above water. Yeah. And I'm looking for peace with that.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to eradicate it. Because I recognize now that me trying to eradicate nihilism is me being firmly in the ego, thinking that I can somehow get rid of it. You can't. I'm still looking for that way, the way to not embrace it, not even resign to it. Just I'm really not sure. Not even to be ambivalent with it. That I don't even know how it is that I should be with nihilism, because every way that I think is bringing me back to kind of the ego, the kind of narcissism which holds me firmly in nihilism in the wrong way. And I'm trying to find the right way to be with it, to be alongside it.
So I noticed
not to be below it, not to be away from it, but to be alongside it.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to look for that way, because that is the only way.
So it's funny, as you were talking about. Well, it's not funny. It's striking. I felt, as you started talking about that, there was a certain moment where I just felt like a load of compassion. Like just I felt the presence of your honesty and sincerity in the personal confrontation with this, right? Of like, it's like there was a moment where it's almost like all the animals like hushed, right? And we just kind of sat around and listened to something quite beautiful of you in some way talking about just you're talking about the fundamental pain of being alive, right? That seems to come from and usher forth from the fact of my existence, right? In which I couldn't have wanted or I couldn't have willed. I'm downstream from all of that, yet this one that's downstream from all of that is left with this responsibility of that everything that I do is in relationship to that, right? And that the whole process on some level involves pain, right? And so I felt this sincerity, right? That was both inspiring and evoked a sense of like compassion that was just there, like, which I think it's my understanding of compassion is like, I've noticed this, like, you know, and because compassion is a big thing that happens in circling a lot, right? Where it's like, it seems like compassion is just the phenomena of when we look at our own or another's suffering without prejudice, when we just look at the fact of suffering. It's like physics. It's like the law of physics. It's not like a feeling you feel. It's just you could encounter and look nakedly at the fact of suffering in any being, and compassion arises, right? It's like, it's not even like a feeling. It's like it's almost like the atoms turn into compassion is what it feels like to me. And that happened as you were talking about that. I just noticed that.
Yeah, it's not even empathy, is it? It is
No.
compassion. Yeah, because empathy is like you're still standing at a distance and,
Right.
and thinking, boy, I'm glad I'm not in that position, but
Yeah.
I can understand what you're going through. That's
Right.
kind of like the empathic response. I think the compassion is the real, like you said. I can't imagine what you're going through, but I really want to be beside you with that. I want to be. I'm not afraid to be with you in that.
It strikes me as an existential realization, right, of the fact of suffering, right? It's like it's transpersonal in that sense, right? It's like, no, it's just the mere fact that anything suffers at all, right? That I feel that there's a compassion that opens. That's the inevitableness of being a being that seems to be a being that's fundamentally good, right? That is enduring something very difficult, right? And doing its best. And like almost all beings, all creatures, on some level, you can that they are alive, right, is communicating something like that. And it's like, so, and there's something about just the fact of suffering got presence in you, and it got presence in me, and it got presence in all beings, and somehow the feeling of compassion is, I don't know, maybe that revelation. Yeah, but you're right. It isn't about, which I think empathy is probably something more like getting in terms of like what's going on. It's more like the essence of your pain, right? Which presupposes the existence of your pain. Those are two different things happening. But I just really felt that. Mm-hmm.
For the compassion, it almost seems like that's what opens up the field, like the scars we've all suffered is the only way you can really feel that compassion to begin with. And that's why when you were saying all that, Guy, it just made me think about how I'm not suffering right now. Like, I'm really not. Like, even when we're talking about suffering, I'm not suffering right now because
he's laying out the goods right now.
My internet connection is the only thing that's making me suffer right now.
Yeah, you always blame it on the internet connection, right? Okay. What was the last part that you didn't say to us?
Yeah, all I wanted to say is it made me very appreciative to realize as we were talking about suffering, something as simple as this makes it so I don't suffer. And like that's all it takes. Like where else I was trying to think of where else I could be. Like I was like having all the cliche thoughts of what else I could be doing that people think is where they'd rather be. And I'm like, no, I'd rather just be right here. Like just talking about this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I have like it probably looks beige to you guys, but it's blue. But like, it's not like I'm in some exotic location. It's not like I have, Mai Tais next to me. Like I'm just sitting in like an old rocking chair behind a regular old wall, just looking at you guys on a screen and listening. And there's nowhere else I'd rather be.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's not a question of assuaging my suffering. For me, it's a question of I have my brothers with me with this suffering. It's like you guys are in the same boat with me, and I'm not alone. So I feel there's a shared experience of that suffering.
Right.
That's for me, I think, is the transformative
communitas
element of this phenomena.
Communitas, yeah.
So it's not a case that you've cured me, you've got rid of my suffering. Absolutely not. But you're willing and courageous enough and compassionate enough to sit with me in my suffering and to share it,
Right. And
so
what it,
that I'm no
yes,
longer alone.
right. You know, it's something about this. There's something that this is highlighting for me that is, it's been a mystery. It's been a mystery to me, right? But I really appreciated what you just said is like what both of you just said. Like Seth, you just said basically like, yeah, like I'm realizing being fully with your suffering, I'm recognizing and feel grateful for I just happen to not be suffering right now. Right. In fact, I'm like there are no babes around, there's no like problems that have been solved, there's nothing, I'm just sitting in this room with you guys, right? And there's some way in which there's a transcendence, but there's also an awareness. It sounds like that awareness of you would not be, you'd rather not be anywhere, like seems to be inherent, right? That at some point you're going to suffer, right? And right now there's like you're in a moment where um, you've transcended a certain kind of suffering, but there's an awareness of the inevitability of that, right? Which I would imagine in some sense you bring into the communitas with whoever is suffering. And I've thought about this because there's this notion of about like attunement, and Heidegger talks a lot about attunement, right? This kind of deep sense of like how a mood, right, somehow is revealing of the kind of like the ontological ground, or your understanding of the ontological ground as a gestalt, unescapable feeling tone, right? That has everything occur in terms of it, right? And then there's this notion of being attuned as a person to another person, right? What that means, right? Because there is this way in which, like, to whatever degree, to be with somebody is really to be attuned to them, right? Like to listen to somebody arises out of, to the degree that to really hear what you're saying is I'm attuned to something with you that's kind of almost pre-thematic in some way, in which like whatever I say and the theories I come up with and the content that I kind of produce out of that, right, is presupposes that attunement. And so there's a way where I've noticed like where I remember one time I really was where I really got this. I was sitting with somebody with just excruciating grief. They like lost 3 kids, or it was like something so profound, right? And there was a way in which being attuned to her, I was like attuned to her grief, right? And feeling that. But there was a way in which I was also something which Seth was, I think, pointing to. I somehow was attuned to like a quality of beingness, right? Like I was attuned to her, but I was also tuned to the quality of care, right? That felt like an aspect or an essential quality of being, if you will, right? That was just there. And so, what I think afforded me to be able to profoundly be with her grief without flinching, right, was also because I was in my listening was attuned to something that went even beyond that grief, right? Um, and I'm wondering about like, and in that sense, there's a communing that happens, right? Of like, because this is something that really I don't hear addressed very often about, and it's a huge loss in our time, right? This sense about community, communitas, right? Like
Mm.
it's it's just I think it's happened so quick. The changes happen so quick. I don't even think it's registered, right? To what degree it's changed, right? This sense of social isolation that people feel across the board. Um, but what that community brings forth, right? Because there's something that goes on in the community, especially when you think of Tillich's notion, right, of the individual being the embodied, the person, right? I think his notion of personhood is the living tension between participation, the mystery of participation, and the mystery of individuation, right? And in participating in a community that somehow affords the individuation, right? So that allows, then is a contribution to participate in the community, which again reveals, restores, and enhances in some sense my own individuality. That ever tightening, transcending evolution of the individual through community, and the community through individual, just seems so central to being a human being, right? I don't think we can. It it in fact, in one of the papers I wrote, I was looking at this notion of, the social sciences kind of think about sociality, right, without even being explicit about it, right? They kind of presuppose in the Cartesian sense that sociality arises through being social, right? There's a sense in which there's us that are social, and once we're social, then this world of sociality arises. But of course, how do you go from a non-social being to a social being if on some level the sociality isn't already there, right? So it's more like, in what ways the ontological itself already social? It's the thing that enables things like communitas, right? In community, it's already social all the way down in some sense. So I think all these themes are kind of, it feels like we're kind of circling around this, right? So you did some of the famous Daniel prayers and salutations and stuff in the corner. Would you say that another way, Daniel?
Are they really that famous? I think what you said with the ontology is inherently social. I think that's a brilliant observation, in the sense, from an existential point of view. I would say from an ontological point of view, that everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
And our own, like the impermanence of all things in their suchness, of all individual things, kind of like that they all are fragile, that they all are finite in that sense. Mm-hmm. That opens up this primordial care, or this space for primordial care or compassion or love or attunement. Only the cracking up makes us relate and love each other and cultivate that in participation. Because otherwise we would land in this kind of like distant, in this cold land of the gods that I tried to explain with this Japanese myth last time, right? The gods are these perfect beings that have no cracks. They don't suffer, but they lack all these existential qualities which we deem very good, memories and so forth. But also memories and vulnerability, like these two things are deeply intertwined, right?
Memory and vulnerability, you said?
Yeah. Even from if you research it, because what those moments of your deepest vulnerability are usually those that stick in your memory, because you don't want to relive them, and you want to learn from them, and that's also like giving birth to a child, for example. You're deeply vulnerable, it deeply hurts, but these are also the moments that transcend you.
Yes.
So the problem is with our age now, because we've lost our ground, right? And Nishitani describes this with this being on a tangent, right? And then in your sense, you can only relate to yourself, and you can only love yourself and care about yourself. And that's this ground of subjectivity. Every path leads ultimately back to itself. So that is what Heidegger called the subjectivity drowns everything into its own immanence. And that's kind of like this realization that we need a deeper ground or another principle from which we can then again build up things such as these practices in an existential sense, but also this kind of like discontingency or impermanence, something like that serves us as a principle. Yeah. And this nihilism is so strange, because in Nishitani, what I often get out of it is that people have always, suffered, and they have had to come to terms with their own mortality and their death. So that's not the new thing. Kind of like the new thing seems to be that this inability to relate, that we cannot cope with it anymore, because we are so bound up with ourselves. That's this kind of like this, the Copernican turn, right? That the ground of everything is subjectivity, and then again the inability to that things like personhood degenerate, and things such as love degenerate, right? Because and then you have these weird dating apps, and you relate, just you everything becomes, every relatedness becomes kind of like instrumental.
Calculable.
Yes.
So the ground, right? The ground of everything becomes subjectivity. And to go back to what you started off saying, is we started to look at, is it fair to say, well, what happens if we say that the ground of everything isn't subjectivity, but it's sociality or communion, right?
And Nishitani talks about this, right? We have this weird capacity when, let's say, you have a fly in your hands, and you press it on it, and it screeches, and then you feel a certain sign. We call this soul. We say it has a soul, and I have a soul, and our souls can relate to each other in something like love or compassion. And that's this inherent sociality. And I think that's this deep interconnectedness that we always need to remember and cultivate and participate in. Because otherwise we land in this land of the ego, where the ground is the ego. And then, I mean, we have seen this in the last century, what happens when we go down this road.
It's a huge category mistake, isn't it? Right, but there's something about that it's able to be mistaken, which is also telling, right, about what's happening. I really appreciated what you said, the interconnectedness. Yeah, and so like from an existential level, we could say like that which is already prehended in sociality is from an ontological level, is that which already arises out of and pre-reveals, if you will, an understanding that all is connected, right? And that interconnection to things, right? That the discontingency of that, right? When we face all the things, the contingencies of our life without that, right? If that's replaced by subjectivity, right? Then all we have, what is it? All we have is almost like a pure contingency.
Yeah, we have the ultimate contingent, right?
Yeah.
And I just want to say that when let's say Seb talks about his suffering, it's precisely this vulnerability and this suffering that opens up these cracks from which we then can relate to each other.
Yes. Okay. So that and here's the important part, is like there's a very big distinction between, I see anyways, is between the experience of exposure and the experience of vulnerability. And I think usually when people think about vulnerability, they're afraid of it and they want to move away from it, because it's really kind of like collapsed with this experience of exposure, where just like you're just all your clothes are taken off in the at the playground, and everyone laughs at you and you're disposed, right? In that sense, that those kinds of things are like the essence of usually most traumas are like that, right? But vulnerability, there's so much communicated to me. I've noticed this. It's like there's something so rich about being with somebody, right, who is voluntarily sharing, right, their vulnerability. And I would say it's the voluntarily moving towards what's hard, right? Which somehow presences. I mean, it's like it's almost impossible to be in the presence of someone doing that without being deeply moved. It's like it seems to be a perception that like you can't just notice from the outside. You undergo it with somebody, right? And I think this is why I'm starting to get some more distinction about maybe what's going on with that, right? And what you're saying, and that when in community, in communitas, right, when someone shares essentially their pain, right, and they do it from a place of like an opening to everybody, right, there's a revealing of that, right? There's a revealing of interconnectivity that's already present in some way for it to even make sense to share that, right? Because if that wasn't a possibility, right, it wouldn't even make sense for that to occur at all, right? But it's that sense where it's not guaranteed, but it's possible that I can unveil myself, right, and open to the other, right? That already it already establishes the others in such a beautiful light, right? And it calls the others to be beyond their own self, right? There's a lot going on with this that I'm
Yeah, it makes it becomes the Tao.
Yeah.
In that move.
It becomes the Tao. What are you getting, Seth? I've noticed when you look up to the left and back and forth a number of times, that's the time to go, what's happening with Seth? And there's like 3 rounds of that so far that I haven't asked you that. So
it's I was trying to connect back to 2 things. When Daniel was talking about Nishitani, he's referencing that we become tangents unto ourselves, where the subject is just the only thing it can do is go back to itself. And then there was something about what Zeb was talking about earlier, that what makes it possible that you have this sense that your being would be inevitable, even if it wasn't like this incarnation of you, that there's something going on that you were going to be anyway. I think what I'm getting out of it is a bit of, for this interconnectedness to occur, there needs to be an emptiness. And what I think of with this vulnerability is like you're actually. Did I lose you guys again? Oh,
almost.
Almost. Right. There's this like the vulnerability seems like you taking on that emptiness where you don't know what's going to happen, but you take it on to provide someone else a space, to provide a place for connections to be made. And just to tie it off, another thing that flashed through my head was in Nishitani, he talks about how Sartre speaks about how man is now to make himself in his own image, that his existence precedes his essence. And Nishitani says that this is an infinite freedom, which ironically turns into the deepest bondage. And it reminds me, I just got started into Colin Wilson, and he wrote over 100 books, and he says it's on the same theme. And the theme is there's this weird tension between once someone tries to take your freedom away from you, you'll fight to your death to get your freedom back. But then if you're given absolute freedom, you're bored to tears. You're just absolutely bored to tears. And there seems to be this, it relates back to the communitas, but also the individuality where, like, if you just have pure community, you have stasis because you're not making any individuals out of it. If you have pure individuality, you just have boredom. You have infinite freedom, but you have no one to play with. Like, it's just you. And that seems to be the problem with that infinite bondage of making yourself, is who's there to appreciate that with? It's just you.
Right.
For me, when Seth was talking there, what what was arising out of that was this sense of being trapped in existence, this sense of existence being a double bind. I'm trying to think my way out of the problem of existence, and it feels like it just keeps thrusting. The problem keeps coming back to me, in the sense that now that I exist, I can't imagine not existing. I can't imagine annihilation of myself, and I don't know which way to turn. I am trapped between these two eternities of darkness, and all I see is myself being a flash of light between these two eternities of darkness. And I'm just like bouncing off between the two. I can't get out. It's a double bind. It's a trap. It really is a fucking trap. And I just can't think myself out of this problem.
Right. And
that's the mystery.
And it's painful, right?
Mm.
Okay, so what is the, here's the question I have is, what is the pain, right, reveal, right? What is the presence of that, you know, because, you know, you're talking about the double bind. I really appreciate that word, right? Who is it? Gregory Bateson did a lot of work around double binds, and it's really such a rich notion, but it's also connected to genius. He said, right? It's like it's connected to, like, double binds on one level can lead to schizophrenia, right? But in another way, double binds and the transcendence of double binds is what's at the bottom of most genius, like genius acts, right? And people who are genius have this proclivity to finding, like, they're attracted to double binds, and they in some sense somehow work out the impossible, right? And it's interesting because a level of a double bind, it's really important to get this, is like a double bind isn't a problem, right? Like a problem presupposes its solvability, right? Mm-hmm. A double bind is something else. It's like if I go, like, well, it's also the thing that comes up. It's also stepping into double binds is also what it takes to be intimate, right, with another. Because usually you're faced with, you're in a relationship with somebody, and like I want to be at one level, I want to be merged forever with absolute security with you, and at the same time I want to stand out as my cosmic individuality, and I want them both absolutely all the time and guaranteed, right? On some deep level, that's like the existential need, if you will. And so, but then inevitably at some point, there's something of myself that's true that I'm afraid that if I say it, it could compromise the security of the relationship, right? But if I don't say it, I'll lose myself, which is intolerable. But if I do say it, I may lose the relationship, which is intolerable, right? And so intimacy are those moments where you actually say the thing, right? And what you have to do in terms of systems, family systems talk a lot about that is a function of your ability to tolerate anxiety, right? Which is really interesting about, like, it's like where because you have to say the thing, right? If you don't, like, the way, well, there's they talk about that there's ways of not tolerating the anxiety. One is to submit, right? So you're just like, okay, we'll just do it your way, right? The other one is to dominate, which is the other one, which is you just take control, right? And you just dominate the whole situation. And the third one, which is I think my favorite, which is just to dissociate. Like, what's happening? Is there a relationship? Is there a me? Huh? Well, what, right? And you just end up married with kids, and you don't quite know how you got there, right? There's no self there. There's no, or to be able to like stay in the anxiety and have the encounter. And the paradox is that the moment you do it, you transcend whatever the content was that you were saying, because when you do it, I think what ends up happening is that no matter what the outcome is, the act of courage is an act of self-transcendence. So like by the time, it's one of those things, by the time that you're done saying it, you're no longer someone that is anxious about saying it, right? You're now in a completely different world with this person, right? And if the other person meets you there, right, and is able to meet you there in that way, then you now have a legitimate sense of security in that relation. And the security is based in that we can do that. And that kind of accounts for a safety that one can start. It's a paradox, because then one starts to feel safe in the relationship, which predisposes them to be able to say things that make everybody anxious. Right? I kind of went on a little tangent there. Where did the tangent start?
Double bind.
Okay, double bind. Yeah. So I think it's like, in some sense, I really agree with you, Daniel. Like or Zeb, it really is. There is a way in which, and I think that some of the things that Daniel have been saying, right, have something to do with, and you even said this, right? If I try to solve my nihilism, I end up like deeper in it, right? If I try to avoid my nihilism, I end up deeper in it, right? If I try to be anything around this nihilism, there's this way where I'm like more and more entrapped, right? And that's fucking painful. But that it's painful reveals what, right? That's the thing about it. I think that there's something about the pain of that reveals something that is, I believe, Zeb, is the dignity that you demonstrate often when you talk about this, right? And I'm not exactly sure what it speaks to, but I want to double click on that.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the whole existence just feels, there's a feeling of wrongness about it all. You know,
Yeah.
it just, nothing about it feels right. It's just this feeling. It's just, this isn't right. You know.
Yeah.
Something's amiss here.
Right.
It's just this feeling of wrongness. I don't know how else to describe it. I'm just grappling with that all the time.
Right.
I'm just disappointed, and I'm angry and upset and annoyed and irritated and bored, and so these are all kind of nihilistic qualities. These are all the but you know, I can just encapsulate the whole thing and say that existence just something about it just feels wrong, and I can't escape from it, because that.
So here's the question. So I think what you said. Okay, so let's look at this. So I think what you said is like, well, what hurts is in the pain. It starts to feel like something's wrong, right? Like this whole thing's just wrong because I can't win in the whole deal, right? Even the act of wanting to win is already losing, right? And so there's all these meta feelings that go about that, right? These feelings about that start to, and then there's this kind of gestalt of suffering that I usually call that gestalt guy. That's the word I use for it. Right? And then he said, I'm just wondering about, and then he said at the end, the whole thing just feels wrong. Now, where do we assign wrong? Right? Something's wrong. If the pain is revealing, right, that something's wrong here. And that's actually what pain really is usually about, right? It's like, you know, It's like the more pain you're in, the more nothing matters, and all you can do, the very pain is asking for you to get rid of it, right? So that's why attention goes there, everything stops. You're in enough pain, man, like nothing else matters, right? And the only thing that matters is, it's basically saying, it's a strange thing. Pain is like this pure says, get rid of me, right? Like, and the more you don't get rid of it, the louder it becomes, right? It's this really weird but deeply constitutional thing that Buddha basically said, look at it. And if you look at it, the whole thing happens. Enlightenment happens. What are you getting, Daniel? What are you noticing?
Yeah, I think it seems to me like what's kind of like wrong here is this, that subjectivity is the center, that the ego is the center. But even when we have this conversation, what we can realize, oh, Seth is there, Seb is there, Guy is there. And beyond that, there's silence, there's compassion, there's even the natural laws, would say the technology that enables all of that. And that's also provided by many people that work in electricity, how's this, towers, and keep the whole thing alive in a sense. So to me, the kind of like the fault, we can kind of like, I can put myself out of the center, and that we have kind of like this multi-centered world. And then I can put the humans also out of center. Then we have nature and earth. And then I can maybe put even what I can see out of center. And then we are in the realm of the beyond, which we really cannot know. And that just shows me that I am not necessarily the center of everything, and it seems to me that often conflicts come from that. Either you perceive yourself as totally outward from participation, or as you're the absolute center of everything. That's Seth alluded to that, right? And often then really these existential problems come from either one of those extremes. But it's always that you put yourself out and see that everything's multi-centered and co-created and co-determined and all of these things. What John Mavecki often talks about, right? And I think that practice really helps to realize that step by step, not just understanding it, realizing in this deep participatory sense that Nishitani keeps reminding us in the book Religion and Nothingness. So and now in the last days I thought really, like, it seems to me that nihilism is really kind of what we call nihilism is really that loss of practices. It seems to be like that, and also no one is having these conversations that we are having, right? And it's so difficult as well because a conversation can go wrong in like millions of ways, but it's still still every conversation I had with you guys, it keeps going, and it has this likeness, right? It's because we come in good spirit and good faith to it,
right? The fifth person blesses us.
See, what I can't shift is this kind of intuition that I have, or this uncanny sense of reality being disturbed from me creating uncertainty about it. That's the strangeness, that's the uncanniness that I feel.
Can you say that again? Can you say that again?
So it's an intuitive feeling.
Yeah.
I'm not being active about it. It's just very intuitive that I have this strange, uncanny sense that my reality is disturbed by me creating uncertainty around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I cannot not feel uncertain
Yeah.
about existence, about everything that is.
Right.
I can't not feel that.
Right.
That has to be the primordial philosophical position that you have to take.
Right.
And so why is that there? And why does it feel uncanny? And it almost feels like that all of that going on is disturbing my reality.
Yeah.
It's like it's coming from me, or is it coming from somewhere else?
Yeah.
Either way, I'm feeling it.
Yeah.
It's intuitive.
Yeah. Is it there right now?
Oh, absolutely.
How do you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's
How
really
do you know
weird.
it's there?
It can strike you in the most mundane of times of my day.
Yeah.
I don't know, it just kind of just
Right.
just feel like really strange
Yeah.
about your existence. And it's not a dissociative thing either. It's not a kind of, I'm not dissociating myself in a kind of schizophrenic way either.
Yeah.
And it's just this kind of intuition that I feel the strangeness about it all.
Yeah.
You know, the
What,
whole thing.
can I ask you? Can I ask
weird.
you? What is it that cares about it as being uncanny or not, in all the ways that you talked about? Like, what is it that cares about it?
I mean, I can only talk about the self, that the ego is as if myself is imbued in uncertainty, and it is that is disturbing my reality.
What is it? The question that I have is like, what is it that cares about being disturbed? Like, what has that? What takes that up as something worthy of being disturbed by?
Yeah, I think it just comes full circle. That I think that it's this kind of longing desire to overcome the uncanniness.
So the longing and desire. So let's just take a second. Let's just let the longing be there. Let's just long. Like, it seems like it's arguable whether or not it's possible to be fulfilled. It's arguable. All that stuff is kind of arguable, right?
Yeah.
But what seems unarguable here is that there is a longing, right?
The longing has to be for something. And if I was to commit myself and say, what is this longing for? It's the longing for eternity. Yeah. But on the same vein, by me purporting to my longing for eternity, it throws itself back at me and says, are you sure? Because better be careful for what you ask for. There's something really frightening about that as well. This kind of longing for eternal consciousness and awareness. It just fills me with dread and boredom, basically.
And it's so true that in the face of the act of longing for it throws you into this kind of existential, inescapable dread. Seems to reveal that whatever that longing is seems inescapably, unarguably there and true.
Right.
Whether or not it's like its actual object is out there or not, or any of that kind of stuff, but it seems like one thing that we can kind of say for sure, I think, is that what's unarguable is you and your experience is that underneath it all, in a very primary way, is that you long for eternity.
Yeah, and that's the religious quest.
Right.
That's. I mean, by me declaring that sense is me being religious, even though I'm not practicing religion by any means.
Right.
I don't follow any religious dogma or practice or anything yet.
I like that you're a non-committed yet absolutely committed religious fanatic.
Yeah. It's by me positing that thought and that question here with you guys is somehow I'm somehow exuding this religious sense.
Right. So if we just say, so for me, guys saying stock sitting with you and being with you, one is I just relate to a lot of this, right, on a personal level. But there's this experience where I'm like, I want you to just live in that longing with every cell of your being. That's what I feel being with you. Now I feel kind of like there's a kind of a heartfelt tenderness that just opened up in my chest as you sit with that, I notice. What are you noticing, Daniel? Underneath your eyes?
I'm just soaking in the atmosphere.
Yeah, what's the atmosphere that you're soaking in?
Well, we talked about the Job story a few times, right? And I think Seb said once he feels like Job and can relate to Job in deep sense.
Yeah.
And kind of like the only thing that we have is kind of like continuing to grapple with all of this.
Yeah.
And continuing to practice. That's by the way, that's all what a lot of people have when they start practicing all of this. It's like whether this is maybe therapy, it's like, oh, why I'm here, why I have to talk with this guy on the other side, like why or when you say with a family therapy, like why shall I go there? It's we are just we are a standard family, and why do we even need all of that? And even youths often have this, they kind of like suffer for years before they get kind of like an inkling, and the suffering starts to alleviate a little bit before you just sit all the time and you're caught up with yourself, and it's just awful. So what Seb said with the uncanniness, it's like that is where we really have to face the infinite. Like when you really think about that we are on a little planet in a giant universe, and we get devoured by the sun at some point, and it's just these massive forces and these black holes everywhere. I mean, that's this homelessness, right? That often in Zen there's like there's just really uncanny. It's really uncanny.
And there's so much dignity in that longing. That's what I'm just present to right now. Like, because you can
and
long
we
for
are we are conscious in the face of that. if you really realize that once, that is really that makes you also appreciate existence, that where we can see this and be a part of it. Right. Still, when I hear uncertainty, I just have to think about what we call in the idleness seminar with Johannes and Joseph Pieper, that in the antiquity it was always wonder and astoundment, which were the beginnings of philosophy, and not this kind of like uncertainty and doubt. So I don't know really what, but also there has something massively shifted in how we experience all of life. Because when we experience it, we could say, oh, that's also great, and we have all these flowers and these animals, and we have all these human beings and everyone's different and everyone has these particular strengths and everything, and it's also wondrous. And it's kind of like, I think we have to get to that place where we can say that, and out of this mode of doubting everything.
I notice as we touch on that longing, on one level we're going through, like I feel like we're going through Zeb and touching on that longing, but it's like, it's a longing, I think, I would say I definitely have, right? Like, I don't know if I would say it exactly like for the eternal, but whatever that points to, it's like that, and that there's, and that whatever that is, that can long for, that puts the act of that longing puts one in absolute uncertainty, right? And it still does it, right? In the face of having an ego that wants total certainty, at this, the ground of that ego, right, is grounded in a longing for something. That's where I feel wonder. That's where I feel wonder. And I just get this sense of dignity, like, around it. There's dignity in that. There's dignity in like, just, it's like the Michelangelo's, right, painting of the two fingers, right? There is this sense where it's like, I oftentimes, when I look at people, like, it feels like within the very center of every human heart are these two fingers, right? And it's interesting because this can be an experience of absolute agony or one of ecstasy, right? And on some level, I feel as though this, in some way, this conversation is like we're circumambulating around what is the difference that makes that difference, right? We're not circulating around how do we get the fingers to touch? Because if the fingers touched, no one would look at that painting. What makes it beautiful is precisely that they don't touch, right? Yet there's a way in which what the significance of that, right, could be one of extreme revelation or one of absolute hell and torture. I think on some level we've been walking around or circling around, kind of asking ourselves, what is the difference that makes that difference, right? On some level. But what I appreciate in the conversation is a very clear sense that at least feels present to me, that the telos of what we're coming from here, and what the telos of the conversation, it isn't about making them touch. I don't get that sense as like, and I think this is one of the things that probably makes this conversation as you alluded to earlier, Daniel, like an unfortunate, unusual one, right? Because I think most conversations are banking on running away from this or making these things touch and solving this problem. But like, I think we're having a conversation in which we're elucidating, and we're, if anything, we're enhancing, and we're asking ourselves, we're not how do they touch, right? But like, how is that good? I think. What are you getting, Seth?
Just reminds me, one of my favorite parts of Religion and Nothingness is how he starts off the book with the religious quest. And that's what I'm getting from it, where that's where that shift comes from doubt to wonder, where it's doubt when you're asking what can it do for you, because it turns into doubt when you have that stance, because it actually never gets fulfilled that way. Like, it's, oh, my internet. Oh, so the doubt, that causes doubt when you're asking what can it do for you, because it's like hitting your head against the wall, because it's not going to do things for you. Like, that's the seeming impersonal coldness. But when you shift it around to ask what you can do for it, that's not the fulfillment in the sense that there's a termination point, but like, it's infinite. You can continually do for it. You can continually love it. That's the inexhaustible, where, and it takes on the dignity of a quest. And I didn't expect to talk so much about Colin Wilson, but I read a book of his called The Age of Defeat, where he's going through the 20th century highbrow literature. And he's pointing out, like with Sartre and a lot of thinkers, how we've come to this myth of insignificance, that our life is just insignificant. There is no such thing as a hero and all of that. And what Nishitani starts off his book right away is, no, like you can set yourself on a religious quest, an infinite religious quest of what can I do for it. And somehow when you become that little hobbit that goes out of Hobbiton, you actually realize that's what you wanted all along. Like it makes everything alive again. To have a mission, to have a purpose, that's what the religious quest is. And we just think that what we think, like the Cartesian sense of what we think is, oh, I should decide what my purpose is. And that's where we bump our heads against walls, because you don't assign yourself a purpose. It's not really a quest at that point. It's like, oh, I'm going to tell myself what to do. Right. All right, well, do that forever. Yeah, you're going to get bored because you don't have the imaginative capacity to imagine a quest for yourself by yourself forever. Like there has to be a partner in it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the religious quest of modernity, is the unmattering that matters to us. And then becomes so unbearable that is how we start out our religious quest, in a sense.
Pain,
and the quest isn't something. I think what Seth, if I was to encapsulate what Seth is saying, a quest isn't it's not an existential choice that one makes at an ontic level. It just is, and you are powerfully drawn to it. Inevitably, you cannot avoid it.
Right.
It's just primordially.
And precisely, you derive it though from the ontic level, right? You derive, and that's the rub, right? Like you find yourself amongst beings, right? And you start to realize that that as you take a stand, right, and hold yourself in the stand amongst beings, right, you're standing on something that all of those presuppose, right? But you got to go through it from the ontic. And I think that is really true because we're not religious as a society anymore, right? And I think we still are, but not in a way that's like super clear by any stretch of the imagination. There is a way in which the religious has to go through, just like Heidegger did it, right? Like through the ontic, through beings. But that in itself already says something, right? Because then it does say, it's like there is a certain point where if the ontic regions of my life, right, in the way that I live them and how I comport them are inconsistent with the ontological sense of being, right, it'll be difficult. What I'm taking from this conversation, I feel like whatever it is in me that's world making, right, that kind of makes my world or participates in whatever that organ is, I feel like it's being tutored. It's being tutored in the sense of like, yeah, just listen to this deep transcendence that you are, and like keep listening to it, like keep in the face of all of it, and then just tune everything to it, align everything to it, right? Knowing that you'll never reach the end of it. It's precisely that ineffable, which is is precisely the point.
And I just want to say this because this fits so well with the fingers, right? And even in between the fingers, you have this kind of like this intermediate realm this is so unfathomable that it's between agony and like the deepest love, you can say. It's so huge. And it reminded me of this, one of my favorite pages from Religion and Nothingness. That's on page 231. I will just read it. So he talks about Nietzsche and the nihility, and he says, of course, when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss starts gazing back into you. That is the self-presentation of nihility, what has been called above a participation in nihility. And only when such an extreme is reached, however, is the fundamental conversion able to occur. And it's not a spatial transition. It's a transition on how you look at the world. It's this aspect identity shift, what John Wakey would call it. It is the turnabout from the great death to the great life. It is something of which we cannot ask why. There can be no conceivable reason for it, and no conceivable basis for it to take hold of. That is to say, this conversion is an event taking place at the point more elemental than the dimension on which events occur that can be spoken of in terms of reasons and basis. If a reason is to be sought, it can only be as the traditional religions have all sought it, on the other side, in God or in Buddha, in something like divine providence, love of God, or the original vow of Amida Buddha. But the reason that is on the side of God or Buddha is not the sort of reason man is after when he asks why. The book of Job cuts deeply into the state of affairs. After all, we can do no other than to say, it is so. There is no room for what or why, not even the what or why issuing from an Hegelian absolute reason. All that is left is that or does.
I like that. Because where I'm at is I'm still in the realm of my ego, seeing this as a problem which is tragic and eternal. And the more that I seek to escape from it, the more it thrusts itself upon me. And that's where I need to get to, where Shitani ends that paragraph. That it's just is.
Yeah, and that's where practice comes. That's definitely where practice comes, right? There's that sense in which there is that sense in which about practice is like, for example, with, I noticed this with writing and all art projects and stuff like that, where you wake up and there's nothing about you that feels like doing it, right? Mm-hmm. And like, you have to kind of, but then once you start, right, and you start writing, then at some point, the activity itself, the ritual of the activity itself catches, right? And then you find yourself no longer noticing that you're not fucked up, right? That you're actually within it. I think that's the whole notion of ritual and practice is essentially, it's that you put your body, mind, and all of your senses in a particular constraint, like a ritual that enact these deep senses so that you embody them. And it's a mystery about this of like, because you then find yourself in terms of that. And the more that you do that, and the more that's a part of your life in repetition, right? The more you kind of find yourself more and more in that state. It's one of the things we talk about with circling of like, it's a practice. What does that mean? It basically means that we're going to practice the asanas of intimacy, right? Not so that you get good at practicing the asanas of intimacy, but so that when you're not practicing the asanas of intimacy, right, you find yourself more intimate in all of your relations, right, over time. And so that sense of practice is so essential around this. I appreciate the emphasis on that. So I have to go, you guys. This has really been a great conversation. walking away. I feel the presence of the fifth one. He's been great to all of us. Yes.
I wish all of you a Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Peaceful Christmas to you all.
Yeah. Merry Christmas. Ho.
You guys.
I'll set up another one
Awesome.
on the calendar. All right. Bye.
Ciao.
See you guys.
Bye bye.